So this F sound shows up in the future and conditional tense of first conjugation verbs. And I remember when I was getting back into learning Irish, even when I was learning Irish in school, it was a complete pain to know how this should be pronounced. Is it an F? Is it a H? Do you pronounce it at all sometimes? What happens to the sounds before and after it, etc.? And there's no real clear guide on how to do this until you actually hear it and realize you're doing it wrong. And I'm hoping to clarify this for you guys, so stick around and let's find out. David Mahasa Chorges, Fáilte Fi. 3 pro tips before I jump into the main content here. The first one, the rules I'm going to go through, don't learn them off as kind of grammar rules or anything like that. If you go down that route, you might have a hard time pronouncing the words in real time because you'll be thinking about grammar rules instead of thinking about what you want to say. So instead, I would focus on learning the examples, repeating them until you kind of tune your ear and your voice into it, and you'll find yourself repeating these sounds naturally instead of thinking about what you should be saying. Secondly, I'm going to go through the different regional variations and how this F in the verb stems is pronounced. Don't worry again about learning like the regional differences. Just like pick a region for now and stick with it. For me, for example, I try to speak Munster Irish as best I can. So you can pick a Connemara variant or a Donegal variant if you want to. So pick one, stick with it, learn it well, and then you can change it later. And thirdly, for each audio sample I'm going to run through, I give the correct spelling as well as a modified spelling, something more phonetic that you guys can read off. So the first scenario is when the F appears after a B, D, or a G. And in this case, it acts like a H. But does that mean it makes a H sound? Not in this case. So a H in Irish, what it typically does is it devoices the prior sound. So what does voicing and devoicing something actually mean? Think of it in English as a difference between V and F. So if you do a V sound, it's V. If you feel your throat, you can feel your vocal cords vibrating. But if you do an F sound, it's the exact same thing you're doing with your mouth, but you're just not vibrating your vocal cords. So that's what happens to these 3 sounds. So let's look at B. B, when devoiced, turns into a P sound. So you might have a verb like this.
Rail.
So you'd think it would make a B sound when you put the F against it, but the B gets devoiced, turns into a P, and in a full sentence ends up sounding like this. The next example is the D. So the D, when devoiced, turns into a T sound. If you got this sentence here, which means before he could, again, you'd think it's going to be a D, but no, it sounds like this. And you get that T sound instead. Again, last one here, we have the G sound. It turns into the sound a C would make, so G to K when devoiced. So a verb with this, you have to understand, which sounds like this.
Take.
And when you put it into a sentence, something like Daddy understood this much, it sounds like this. And you'll notice that it no longer makes the G sound, it kind of makes this k sound instead. So again, learn off the example. So something similar happens after BH and MH. Now these are normally kind of V sounds. So generally speaking, the V gets devoiced to an F. So instead of a V, you get a F. So let's say the verb to write, it sounds like this. But in the future tense, you get rid of that V and you go, let's say, all right, so it's an F sound instead of the V, completely devoiced. So interestingly, as you move into Munster, you still get the F sound every now and again, but more often than not, you're going to get a H sound instead. And that's because the BH and MH are often silent as opposed to this kind of V sound. So realistically, I suppose it's been treated as if it's after a vowel instead. So here's an example of this happening from a Cork speaker. So you'll notice there it clearly sounded like a H instead of an F. Small point of interest here about the Irish of Munster. You'll notice she said láhad, so an FAD at the end. This is actually because what she's doing is she's combining the pronoun with the verb, which is really, really common in Munster. But you can still split them, so it could be láhame as well. After C, CH, PST, and TH, there's absolutely no change whatsoever. So no F sound is made, no H sound is made, there's no devoicing, no nothing. And that's because these consonants are already devoiced. Interestingly, with the TH sound, that's already a H sound at the end of a word. So I suppose you're adding 2 H sounds together, meaning there's no difference, it's just pronounced as a H. So here are some examples of this after C, T, S, and TH.
Tukame, Ishtame, Isame.
And you'll notice in all of these cases, there's absolutely no sound change at all. Next up, we have M, L, N, and R, and things get a little bit easier here. So after these consonants, we actually retain the consonant sound, and it's pretty much always pronounced like a H. So if you have the verb to clean, glon, in the future tense, I will clean sounds like this.
Glonhame.
So for me, I usually stick to this H sound in these cases, but there are some regional variants as well. So if you're in Cushadaga, which is the kind of eastern part of Connemara, just to the west of Galway, this makes no sound whatsoever, no H and no F, because they do it differently out there. And on the western end of Cushadaga, these sounds can also become devoiced in the same way I talked about above, meaning you just don't vibrate your vocal cords when you say them. And that can happen in some other regions as well. Next up, we have the F after a vowel, and there's a considerable amount of regional variation here. If we start with Connemara, it's mostly a H. So if you have the verb to read, I will read lehime, so that's a H sound. If you go into Cushadaga again, because they do it differently over there, there's no sound at all. There's no F, there's no H, there's no nothing. As you move into Munster, it's a H sound, but you can sometimes hear an F. So me personally, I stick with a H for this sound. Here's an example saying that he will sit in the chair. And you can hear the H sound is very clear here. Then as we move further north into the country, let's say around Donegal, the south end of Donegal, you can hear an F. But up north, something very interesting actually happens. So instead of getting a H or an F sound, you get this broad CH sound instead. So let's say the verb to sit, instead of getting sihime, you get sihime. So super interesting sound change up there. Last but not least, there are 3 verb forms worth calling out. These are the autonomous form for the future, autonomous form for the conditional, and the second person conditional verb form, as in you would. Here's what they sound like for a Cork speaker.
Ísfar, dísfar, the hísfui.
And you'll notice that the spelled F is actually pronounced like an F. So this is especially true in Munster. Pretty much all the time these are going to be pronounced like an F. As you move further north into the country, they tend to be pronounced more like a H, and in that case the same devoicing applies as I talked about earlier. And once again in Cushadaga it can tend to fall completely silent because that's how they roll. Hopefully this video was a help. Go ahead, learn the examples. Remember, don't learn these as rules. I think you'll go crazy. And yeah, if you like the video, like, subscribe, share, and hopefully it helps.